What did he just say? Did he say Margaret Hayes?
The housekeeper? That has to be a mistake. Read that again. There is no mistake. These are Richard Whitmore's final signed instructions.
The obituary was only 43 words long. It announced that American billionaire Richard Whitmore, founder of Whitmore Industrial Holdings, had passed away peacefully at the age of 74 after a brief illness. Newspapers called him a visionary. Financial networks described him as one of the last self-made manufacturing giants of his generation. Investors remembered the empire he built from a single warehouse into a company worth billions of dollars. But none of those headlines prepared anyone for what happened 3 days later inside a quiet funeral chapel just outside Boston. Before we go any deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. What unfolded that morning would erase decades of assumptions, destroy reputations, and force one woman to question every memory she had of the man she called her father. Richard Whitmore's only child, Emily Whitmore, walked into the chapel believing she was saying goodbye to the last remaining member of her immediate family. She carried herself with the quiet confidence people expected from someone raised inside extraordinary wealth. Friends of the family assumed the funeral would be emotional, but straightforward. Emily would inherit Whitmore Industrial Holdings, several estates, investment portfolios spread across the country, and enough assets to secure generations of the Whitmore name. It seemed like the natural conclusion to a life that had always appeared carefully planned. Executives who had spent decades helping Richard build his business sat together near the front of the chapel. Longtime attorneys quietly reviewed folders one final time. Former employees exchanged stories about the demanding but respected businessman they had known. Everything appeared exactly as tradition demanded until the family's attorney stood and opened the final signed version of Richard Whitmore's will. The first few sentences sounded ordinary enough. Charitable donations were listed. Long-serving employees received generous gifts. Several educational foundations were funded in Richard's name. No one seemed surprised. Then came the sentence that silenced the entire room. Richard Whitmore had left almost every meaningful asset he owned to Margaret Hayes, the family's live-in housekeeper who had worked inside the Whitmore residence for 28 years. Every major company under his control. Every commercial property, every investment account, every private residence except one small vacation cabin. Nearly everything he had spent a lifetime building belonged to the woman who had quietly cleaned his home every morning before anyone else woke up. For several seconds no one moved. Some believed they had misunderstood what had been read. Others immediately assumed there had been a legal mistake. Faces filled with confusion slowly hardened into suspicion. People began asking the same question in hushed voices. How could this possibly happen? Richard Whitmore had only one child. Emily had spent years preparing to eventually oversee the family business. She had attended board meetings, represented the company at charitable events, and earned degrees that everyone believed were part of her father's long-term succession plan. Yet in a matter of moments, every expectation disappeared. Some guests looked directly at Margaret Hayes with expressions that openly accused her of manipulating an elderly man during his final years.
She manipulated him.
She was living in that house every day. He was elderly. He wasn't thinking clearly.
Someone should challenge this will.
Others quietly suggested Richard must have lost the ability to make rational decisions before his death. Theories spread across the chapel almost instantly. But while everyone else searched for someone to blame, one small detail escaped nearly everyone in the room. Margaret Hayes did not celebrate. She did not smile. She did not even look relieved. She lowered her head, closed her eyes, and held back tears that seemed to carry far more pain than victory. It was the reaction of someone receiving news she had hoped would never become public. Emily noticed it immediately. For all the anger and disbelief racing through her mind, she could not ignore the expression on the woman standing across the room. If Margaret had orchestrated this inheritance, why did she look as though she had just lost something she could never replace? That single question would stay with Emily long after the funeral ended, because it refused to fit the story everyone else had already decided to believe. As mourners slowly prepared to leave, another unexpected moment changed everything once again. An elderly legal assistant approached Emily carrying a weathered envelope with her father's handwriting across the front. It had not been included with the official reading of the will, because Richard had given strict instructions that it be delivered only after the service was over and only into his daughter's hands. Emily stared at the envelope without opening it. The paper looked old despite being sealed only weeks earlier, as though it had spent years waiting for exactly this day. She had no idea that inside was the first piece of a story stretching back nearly 30 years, a story involving promises that were never spoken aloud, sacrifices no newspaper had ever reported, and one decision that had quietly shaped every major moment of her family's life without her ever realizing it. At that moment, Emily believed she had come to bury her father. She had no idea she was about to meet the man he had spent decades hiding from the world. And before the sun set on the day of his funeral, she would begin uncovering a truth that would force her to reconsider everything she thought she knew about loyalty, love, gratitude, and the true cost of keeping a promise. The fortune Richard Whitmore left behind was enormous, but compared to the secret buried beneath it, the money would soon become the least important part of the story. Nobody in that chapel realized they were witnessing the end of one story and the beginning of another. The inheritance itself would dominate newspaper headlines for weeks, but the money was only the surface of a mystery that had been quietly taking shape for nearly 30 years. Reporters standing outside the funeral home believed they had found the perfect headline. A billionaire leaves everything to his maid, while his own daughter walks away with almost nothing. To millions of people reading those headlines later that afternoon, the conclusion seemed obvious before they even reached the second sentence. They assumed an aging businessman had been manipulated during the final chapter of his life. It was the kind of story people believed they had heard before, another example of enormous wealth changing hands under suspicious circumstances. Yet every person who rushed to judgment was missing the one detail that mattered most. The woman receiving the fortune never behaved like someone who had won anything. Margaret Hayes did not speak to reporters waiting outside the chapel. She did not acknowledge the cameras pointed toward her. She declined every request for an interview and quietly left through a side entrance before most guests had even reached the parking lot. People who had known her for years described her as dependable, respectful, and almost invisible. She had spent nearly 3 decades caring for the Whitmore residence without ever becoming the center of attention. Even many executives who visited Richard Whitmore's estate every month could barely remember the sound of her voice. She completed her work with remarkable consistency and then disappeared into the background, allowing everyone else to occupy the spotlight. That made the contents of Richard's will even more confusing. Why would one of America's most calculating businessmen place the future of an entire corporate empire into the hands of someone who had never expressed the slightest interest in wealth, influence, or recognition? Emily Whitmore found herself asking the same question, but another thought troubled her even more. If her father truly believed she was unworthy of continuing his legacy, why had he never said so while he was alive? Richard Whitmore had built his reputation on directness. Inside boardrooms, he was known for making difficult decisions without hesitation. Employees respected him because they always knew where they stood. He rewarded loyalty generously, but he expected excellence in return. That same discipline shaped the way he raised his daughter. Emily had grown up believing every achievement required sacrifice, because that was the lesson her father repeated through his actions. He rarely offered praise, but he invested heavily in her education, introduced her to the business from an early age, and gradually allowed her to observe the decisions that transformed Whitmore Industrial Holdings into one of the country's most successful privately owned manufacturing companies. Nothing in those years suggested he intended to remove her from the future he had spent decades preparing. Then there was the envelope resting in Emily's hands. Unlike the official documents prepared by attorneys, this one belonged entirely to Richard. The handwriting across the front was unmistakable, firm and deliberate despite the illness that had weakened him during his final months. Emily considered opening it immediately but hesitated. Part of her feared that whatever waited inside would only deepen the wound already opened by the reading of the will. Another part believed the answers she desperately wanted had to begin somewhere, and her father had chosen this letter as the starting point. As she traced her fingers across the aging paper, she noticed something unusual. Tucked beneath the envelope was a faded photograph that had slipped loose without anyone noticing. The image showed a much younger Richard standing beside Margaret Hayes almost 3 decades earlier. Neither of them appeared wealthy. Neither wore expensive clothing. More surprising than anything else was the expression on Richard's face. Emily had seen thousands of photographs of her father throughout his career, yet she had never seen him looking at anyone with such overwhelming gratitude. It was the expression of a man who believed he owed someone far more than words could ever repay. That single photograph created a question Emily could not ignore. Margaret had entered the Whitmore household as a housekeeper, or at least that was the story everyone accepted without hesitation. But photographs do not lie. If she had been standing beside Richard long before the mansion, the luxury cars, and the billion-dollar company, then their relationship began years before anyone believed it had. Suddenly the timeline no longer made sense. Richard had always described Margaret as a loyal employee who joined the household after Emily's mother became ill. Yet this photograph clearly existed years before that period. Had her father deliberately rewritten the history of how Margaret entered their lives? If so, what reason could possibly justify hiding something so ordinary? Emily had spent her entire life surrounded by carefully organized records, family albums, and business archives. Her father documented everything. The idea that he had concealed something as simple as an old friendship suggested the truth might be far more complicated than anyone imagined. As the afternoon faded into evening, conversations across the country continued to focus on the fortune Richard Whitmore had left behind. Television commentators debated whether the will would survive legal challenges. Financial analysts discussed the uncertain future of Whitmore Industrial Holdings. Legal experts predicted years of courtroom battles between Emily Whitmore and Margaret Hayes. Yet while strangers argued over billions of dollars, Emily found herself becoming less interested in the inheritance itself and more interested in understanding the man who had signed it away. For the first time in her life, she realized there were entire chapters of her father's past she had never questioned because she never believed they existed. The funeral had ended, but the mystery had only begun. Hidden somewhere inside Richard Whitmore's carefully protected life was a truth powerful enough to overturn everything the world believed about his final decision. Emily had no way of knowing that the first step toward uncovering it would lead her back almost 40 years, to a time before wealth, before fame, and before the Whitmore name meant anything at all. Richard Whitmore had spent most of his adult life convincing the world that success could erase the past. Business magazines celebrated his discipline, television interviews praised his relentless work ethic, and aspiring entrepreneurs studied his career as though it were a blueprint for the American dream. According to the version of history repeated in countless articles, Richard began with almost nothing, borrowed enough money to rent a neglected warehouse on the outskirts of Cleveland, and slowly transformed a struggling machine parts business into one of the country's largest industrial manufacturers. Investors admired his patience during economic downturns. Competitors respected his ability to identify opportunities before anyone else noticed them. Employees often described him as demanding but fair, a man who expected excellence because he demanded the same from himself every single day. It was an inspiring story, one that seemed to prove determination could overcome almost any obstacle. Yet like many stories that become legendary, the version shared with the public left out the people whose sacrifices made that success possible. Long before private jets, corporate headquarters, and magazine covers became part of his life, Richard was simply another young man trying to build something that would outlast him. He grew up in a modest neighborhood where families measured success one paycheck at a time, and where uncertainty shaped almost every decision. His father worked long hours without ever earning enough to provide much security, while his mother stretched every dollar until there was almost nothing left to stretch. Richard learned early that stability could disappear overnight. That lesson stayed with him long after childhood ended. Friends remembered someone who rarely complained, rarely celebrated, and never allowed himself to become comfortable. While others dreamed about quick success, Richard believed lasting achievement demanded years of quiet persistence. It was an attitude that eventually made him wealthy, but it also built emotional walls so high that very few people were ever allowed to see the man hidden behind them. When Whitmore Industrial Holdings finally began attracting national attention, Richard carefully shaped the image he wanted the world to remember. He spoke about innovation, discipline, and responsibility. He thanked mentors, investors, and dedicated employees for helping him grow the company. He donated generously to universities, hospitals, and veterans organizations. Every public appearance reinforced the same message. Richard Whitmore had built his empire through determination, integrity, and sacrifice. The public embraced that story because it was inspiring. It gave people someone to admire during uncertain economic times. Yet there was one name that almost never appeared in interviews, speeches, or corporate anniversaries. Margaret Hayes remained entirely absent from the official history of Whitmore Industrial Holdings, despite the fact that she had quietly remained part of Richard's life through nearly every important milestone. Anyone reading company archives would assume she entered the family years later as an employee. That assumption would eventually prove to be one of the biggest misunderstandings in the entire story. Emily grew up surrounded by extraordinary privilege without fully recognizing how unusual her life really was. The Whitmore estate stretched across acres of carefully maintained grounds where every detail reflected her father's pursuit of perfection. There were private tutors before prestigious schools, summer programs that introduced her to future political leaders and business executives, and family vacations planned with military precision. From the outside, the Whitmore family seemed to represent everything people associated with success, yet appearances often concealed a quieter reality. Richard loved his daughter deeply, but expressing affection never came naturally to him. Instead of saying he was proud, he invested in her future. Instead of offering comfort during difficult moments, he encouraged resilience. He believed preparing Emily to survive life's hardships was a greater act of love than shielding her from disappointment. As a result, father and daughter respected each other enormously, but there was always an invisible distance neither of them seemed able to cross. Emily's mother, Catherine Whitmore, filled many of the emotional spaces Richard struggled to reach. She brought warmth into a home that often felt organized more like a corporate headquarters than a family residence. Birthdays became celebrations because of Catherine. Holidays felt meaningful because she insisted that business could wait until tomorrow. She remembered anniversaries, encouraged spontaneous traditions, and quietly reminded Richard that success meant very little if there was no one with whom to share it. Emily adored her mother, believing she possessed the rare ability to make everyone around her feel important. Even employees noticed the difference Catherine made inside the household. Staff members often said the atmosphere changed the moment she entered a room. Her kindness reached people regardless of their position, treating executives and housekeepers with exactly the same respect. Years later, Emily would struggle to remember the sound of her mother's laughter without also remembering how suddenly it disappeared from their home. Catherine's declining health became the first event that truly changed the Whitmore family. At first, the illness appeared manageable. Appointments with specialists increased, medications changed, and hopeful reports occasionally lifted everyone's spirits. Richard rearranged business schedules whenever possible, though work still demanded more of his attention than he wanted to admit. Emily was young enough to believe adults could solve any problem if they worked hard enough. She watched doctors arrive, nurses come and go, and relatives offer quiet encouragement, never imagining that some battles cannot be won through determination alone. During those difficult months, another familiar presence gradually became indispensable inside the household. Margaret Hayes assumed responsibilities that extended far beyond housekeeping. She coordinated schedules, prepared meals, managed medications when nurses left for the evening, and remained available through countless sleepless nights. She asked for no recognition because she believed the family needed stability more than gratitude. Emily noticed Margaret's reliability, but never questioned why her father trusted her with responsibilities that reached far beyond those of an ordinary employee. After Catherine passed away, the mansion changed in ways that no renovation could ever repair. Rooms remained perfectly furnished, yet they somehow felt empty. Celebrations became shorter. Family dinners grew less frequent. Richard immersed himself even more deeply in expanding the business, convincing himself that constant work offered protection against grief. Emily responded differently. She buried herself in school, extracurricular activities, and eventually university studies. Hopping achievement might fill the silence left by her mother's absence. Through every one of those transitions, Margaret remained exactly where she had always been. She prepared breakfast before sunrise, maintained the household with remarkable consistency, and quietly ensured daily life continued even when everyone else struggled to move forward. It became so normal seeing Margaret in the background that Emily stopped noticing her altogether. Looking back years later, that realization would trouble her deeply. Someone had stood beside her family during its happiest memories and its greatest heartbreaks, yet she had never once wondered why Margaret's loyalty never seemed to end. As Emily sorted through old family albums that evening after the funeral, she noticed something else that had escaped her for years. Margaret appeared in dozens of photographs, though rarely at the center. Sometimes she stood in the distance during birthday parties. Sometimes she appeared carrying decorations before holiday dinners. Occasionally, she could be seen helping Catherine arrange flowers or smiling faintly while watching Emily open Christmas presents. Her presence was subtle enough that most people would overlook it entirely, but once Emily recognized the pattern, she could no longer ignore it. Margaret had witnessed virtually every important moment in the Whitmore family's history. She had been there before Catherine's illness, throughout the painful months that followed, and during every milestone afterward. It raised an unsettling question. How could someone remain so deeply woven into the fabric of a family's life, while revealing almost nothing about her own? Emily suddenly realized she knew remarkably little about the woman who had inherited everything her father left behind, and that absence of knowledge felt less like coincidence and more like something carefully preserved over many years. Emily continued turning the pages long after midnight, paying less attention to the people standing at the center of each photograph than to the faces lingering around the edges. The more carefully she looked, the more impossible it became to dismiss what had always been hiding in plain sight. Margaret Hayes was there before every major celebration began and remained long after everyone else had left. She stood quietly in the background of Emily's 6th birthday party, holding a tray of cake plates while Richard laughed beside Catherine. She appeared near the garden during a company picnic, where hundreds of employees gathered to celebrate the opening of a new manufacturing plant. She could even be seen outside the family church after Catherine's memorial service, her face marked by the same quiet sorrow carried by immediate relatives rather than household staff. None of those images had seemed unusual when Emily was younger. Children rarely questioned the adults who consistently surround them, but now every photograph felt less like a memory and more like a clue her father had unknowingly preserved. As dawn approached, Emily organized dozens of photographs across the dining room table, arranging them by year rather than by event. It was a habit she had inherited from Richard, who believed that timelines often revealed details hidden by emotion. Within an hour, another inconsistency emerged. According to every story Emily had ever heard, Margaret joined the Whitmore household shortly after Catherine's health began to decline. Yet the photographs told a different story entirely. Margaret appeared several years before Catherine showed any visible signs of illness. She was present during company celebrations that took place long before Emily entered middle school. She stood beside Richard during the groundbreaking ceremony for Whitmore Industrial's second factory, an event that newspaper archives clearly dated years earlier than anyone claimed she arrived. The timeline Richard had repeated throughout Emily's childhood simply could not be true. Whether he had intentionally changed those details, or whether everyone else had misunderstood them, someone had quietly rewritten a chapter of the family's history. Emily slept only a few hours before driving to Whitmore Industrial's corporate headquarters, a place she had known almost as well as her own home. The towering glass building reflected decades of ambition, carrying Richard's name across its entrance with understated confidence. Employees greeted her respectfully, though their expressions revealed the same uncertainty spreading across the company since news of the inheritance became public. Some looked sympathetic, others seemed uncomfortable. A few avoided eye contact altogether, unsure whether Emily still held any authority within the organization her father had spent 40 years building. For the first time since childhood, she entered the executive archives not as the future leader everyone expected her to become, but as a daughter searching for answers no financial statement could provide. She ignored the legal documents stacked neatly inside conference rooms and headed instead toward the historical records department, where company photographs, newsletters, newspaper clippings, and employee files had been preserved with extraordinary care. The company archivist had worked under Richard for more than 30 years and remembered nearly every milestone the business had experienced. He welcomed Emily warmly, but seemed hesitant when she began asking about Margaret Hayes. The hesitation lasted only a second, but Emily noticed it immediately. Years spent observing corporate negotiations had taught her that silence often revealed more than words. The archivist eventually admitted that Margaret's name rarely appeared in official company records, despite her unusually long association with Richard. According to payroll files, she had been employed as a domestic housekeeper for 28 years, exactly as everyone believed. Yet several earlier photographs stored in the company's private collection showed Margaret attending events that predated her employment by nearly a decade. When Emily pointed out the contradiction, the archivist quietly confessed that Richard had personally instructed staff never to discuss those earlier years unless absolutely necessary. It was one of the few requests Richard had ever made without offering an explanation. Those words echoed in Emily's mind as she continued searching through storage cabinets that had not been opened in years. Richard Whitmore was a man who documented everything. Every acquisition, every expansion, every charitable donation, every board decision had been preserved with meticulous precision. The idea that he would deliberately restrict information about one individual stood in sharp contrast to the rest of his character. He believed records protected the truth, yet in Margaret's case he had chosen concealment instead. Emily found herself wondering whether her father had been protecting Margaret from something, or protecting everyone else from learning something about himself. The distinction mattered because it suggested two very different motives. One implied gratitude, the other implied guilt. Neither possibility explained why an entire corporate empire had ultimately changed hands through a single signature. By late afternoon, Emily uncovered a collection of newsletters published during the earliest years of Whitmore Industrial Holdings. They chronicled the company's modest beginnings, celebrating small victories that eventually laid the foundation for enormous success. Richard appeared frequently in those pages alongside mechanics, engineers, investors, and suppliers. Then, tucked between articles announcing the purchase of new machinery, Emily found a group photograph that immediately caught her attention. Standing beside Richard was Margaret Hayes, noticeably younger but unmistakably the same woman. Unlike later photographs where she remained quietly in the background, this time she occupied the front row alongside the company's earliest leadership team. No caption identified her as a housekeeper. Instead, the image simply listed everyone as members of the founding operations group. Emily stared at the photograph for several minutes before carefully turning it over. Written across the back in Richard's handwriting were 7 simple words. The people who made this possible. Margaret's name appeared first on the list. Emily felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cool temperature inside the archives. Her father had spent decades allowing the world to believe he built his empire almost entirely through his own determination. Yet this forgotten photograph suggested Margaret had stood beside him from the very beginning. If that were true, then the inheritance no longer looked like the irrational decision of a lonely old man. It began to resemble something else entirely, something rooted in obligations formed long before wealth entered either of their lives. Still, one question remained painfully unanswered. If Margaret had helped build the foundation of Whitmore Industrial, why had Richard hidden her contribution from everyone, including his own daughter? Successful entrepreneurs often celebrated the people who helped them reach the top. Richard had done the opposite. He had erased Margaret from the public story, while quietly keeping her close for nearly 30 years. That evening, Emily returned to the family estate carrying copies of every photograph and document she had uncovered. The mansion felt even quieter than it had after the funeral. Most household staff had been given several days away while attorneys sorted through legal matters, leaving the enormous home strangely empty. As she walked through the familiar hallways, Emily noticed details she had ignored for years. Portraits of her father lined the walls, documenting each stage of his career, yet none included Margaret despite the evidence that she had been present through nearly all of them. Family albums placed her at the edge of every important memory, while official portraits excluded her completely. It was as though Richard wanted her close enough to remain part of their lives, but distant enough that no outsider would ever ask questions. Emily stopped outside her father's private study, a room he rarely allowed anyone to enter without permission. The door stood slightly open, just as it had on the morning after his funeral. For a long moment she hesitated, remembering how fiercely Richard protected that room throughout her childhood. Then she quietly stepped inside, unaware that hidden somewhere among decades of carefully organized papers was the first piece of evidence explaining why Richard Whitmore had spent half his life protecting a secret he believed could never be allowed to die with him. Emily closed the study door behind her and stood in complete silence, allowing herself a moment to absorb the room she had entered countless times as a child, but had never truly examined. Richard Whitmore believed that every object should have a purpose, and his office reflected that philosophy with remarkable precision. Shelves stretched from floor to ceiling, filled with leather-bound journals, industry reports, framed awards, and carefully labeled binders arranged in perfect chronological order. Nothing appeared out of place. Even the fountain pen resting on the center of his desk sat exactly parallel to the edge of a yellow legal pad containing several unfinished notes written during the final weeks of his life. Emily slowly walked around the room, realizing that every major decision shaping the Whitmore empire had likely been made within these walls. Yet despite decades of financial success, the study contained surprisingly few reminders of wealth. Instead, Richard surrounded himself with memories of hard work, photographs of manufacturing plants, and small keepsakes collected during business trips across the country. It was the office of a man who measured his life through responsibility rather than luxury. She began opening drawers one at a time, expecting to find legal records or business correspondence, but instead discovered something far more personal. Richard had preserved nearly every letter Emily had ever written to him. Crayon drawings from elementary school sat beside Father's Day cards folded with tiny hands. School essays, graduation announcements, birthday notes, and holiday messages had all been carefully stored inside dated folders. Emily smiled through tears as she realized her father had quietly kept pieces of her childhood that she barely remembered creating. The discovery softened some of the anger she had carried since the funeral, because it reminded her that Richard's love had never disappeared. He simply expressed it differently than most fathers. Yet that realization also deepened the mystery. A man who treasured every handwritten note from his daughter could not have erased her from his future without believing he had an overwhelming reason. Richard had never been careless with the people he loved. If he had chosen Margaret over Emily in his final will, then he must have believed he was correcting something that had remained unresolved for years. Inside the lowest drawer of a locked filing cabinet, Emily found several leather journals bearing dates that stretched back more than 3 decades. They were not business records. They were personal reflections, written irregularly over many years. Richard had never mentioned keeping a journal, making their existence feel strangely intimate. Emily hesitated before opening the first volume, uncertain whether reading her father's private thoughts crossed a boundary he would have wanted respected. But that hesitation faded when she remembered the envelope he had intentionally left for her after his death. Richard wanted her to understand something. He had known she would search for answers, and perhaps these journals were part of the path he expected her to follow. The earliest entries described the uncertainty of launching a small manufacturing company with almost no capital, the fear of failure, and the constant pressure of making payroll. They painted the portrait of a determined young entrepreneur carrying burdens few people ever witnessed. Then, several pages later, one name appeared for the very first time. Margaret. There was no surname, no explanation of who she was. Richard simply wrote that without Margaret's faith, the company would never survive its first year. Emily reread the sentence several times, convinced she had misunderstood it. Her father described investors elsewhere by full name, recorded business partners with meticulous detail, and carefully documented every important contract. Yet Margaret appeared almost casually, as though Richard expected his future self to understand exactly who he meant. Over the following pages her name surfaced again and again. Richard thanked her for believing in him during moments when even he questioned whether the company could survive. He mentioned long nights spent solving problems together, difficult decisions made side by side, and sacrifices that neither of them expected anyone else to understand. Still, he never explained what those sacrifices were. It felt as though entire chapters had been removed from the story, leaving only enough information to suggest their importance without revealing the truth behind them. Emily continued reading until she reached an entry written several years after Whitmore Industrial finally became profitable. Richard's handwriting grew noticeably heavier across the page, almost as though each sentence required greater effort than the last. He wrote that success had brought opportunities he once believed impossible, but it had also demanded choices he would regret for the rest of his life. He described waking each morning with gratitude for everything he had achieved while carrying a debt that no financial achievement could erase. One sentence stood apart from the others, underlined twice in dark ink. Some debts are measured in dollars. Others are measured in the years someone gives away so another person can keep moving forward. Emily closed the journal for a moment, staring out the study window as those words settled into her thoughts. They sounded less like reflections on business, and more like the confession of a man haunted by something he believed money alone could never repay. She returned to the shelves and searched for the next journal covering the years immediately after her mother entered the story. The tone shifted almost instantly. Richard wrote about meeting Catherine, describing her kindness, intelligence, and remarkable ability to see goodness in people before they recognized it themselves. Emily smiled as she read the pages devoted to the early years of her parents' relationship. They revealed a version of Richard far gentler than the businessman known to the public. Yet even within those hopeful entries, Margaret's name continued appearing with surprising frequency. Richard wrote that Catherine understood more than anyone realized. He thanked her for accepting circumstances that would have driven many people away. Another entry simply read, "Catherine sees Margaret for who she truly is, and because of that, I love her even more." Emily stopped reading again. If her mother understood the connection between Richard and Margaret, then whatever secret existed had never been hidden from Catherine. That realization overturned another assumption Emily had carried since the funeral. Her mother had not been an outsider to this mystery. She had lived beside it every single day. The deeper Emily searched, the clearer one fact became. Her father had spent decades writing around a truth without ever writing it directly. It was as though he feared that putting certain events into words might someday expose people he desperately wanted to protect. He hinted at promises, sacrifices, impossible choices, and lifelong obligations, but always stopped just short of explaining them. The journals resembled pieces of a puzzle, with the most important sections deliberately missing. Then, tucked inside the back cover of the final journal, Emily found a folded receipt from a bank safe deposit box rented nearly 29 years earlier. Richard had renewed the rental every year without interruption until his death. Written beside the box number was a brief instruction in his unmistakable handwriting. If Emily is searching, she is finally ready to know everything. The key is where it has always been. Emily's pulse quickened. Somewhere inside the house was a key her father had hidden in plain sight for almost 3 decades, and whatever waited inside that safe deposit box was important enough for him to protect until the very end of his life. Emily remained seated at her father's desk, holding the small receipt between her fingers as though it might reveal more if she stared at it long enough. Richard Whitmore had never believed in vague instructions. Throughout his career, he built systems designed to eliminate confusion, making decisions only after considering every possible consequence. If he wrote that the key was where it had always been, he expected her to recognize the place eventually. The challenge was remembering which parts of the house had remained untouched for nearly 30 years. Her eyes slowly wandered across the study, taking in the familiar arrangement of bookshelves, framed photographs, antique clocks, and carefully polished furniture that had barely changed since her childhood. Then her attention settled on a brass compass displayed inside a glass case near the window. Richard often called it the only possession he owned before success found him. He claimed it reminded him to stay focused whenever business became overwhelming. Emily had heard that story dozens of times growing up, yet she suddenly realized she had never actually seen him use the compass. It had always remained inside the same locked display, almost as though preserving it mattered more than understanding it. She crossed the room, unlocked the small cabinet, and carefully lifted the weathered compass into her hands. The metal felt heavier than she expected. As she turned it over, she noticed 4 tiny scratches near the hinge that had never caught her attention before. Gently pressing the worn edge caused the back panel to release with a soft click. Hidden inside was a small silver key wrapped in yellowed cloth. Emily stood perfectly still, overwhelmed not only by the discovery itself, but by the realization that the key had been sitting within reach for most of her life. She remembered dusting that very cabinet with her mother as a teenager. She remembered watching Richard pause beside it countless evenings before returning to work. Every day for nearly 3 decades, the answer had remained only a few feet away, protected not by complicated security, but by the simple assumption that no one would ever think to look inside. It felt exactly like her father, elegant in its simplicity and deeply personal in its meaning. The following morning, Emily drove to the downtown branch of the private bank Richard had used since the earliest years of Whitmore Industrial. Unlike newer financial institutions built around glass and technology, the building carried an old-world atmosphere that emphasized privacy above everything else. Generations of business owners had trusted the bank with documents they considered too valuable to leave anywhere else. When Emily presented the receipt and the key, the branch manager immediately recognized her father's name. His expression shifted almost imperceptibly, suggesting he had anticipated this visit for some time. Without unnecessary conversation, he escorted Emily through a series of secure corridors until they reached the vault where hundreds of safe deposit boxes rested behind thick steel doors. The manager located Richard's box, inserted the bank's master key alongside Emily's, and quietly stepped away to give her complete privacy. As the heavy drawer slid open, Emily expected stacks of financial records or perhaps another version of the will. Instead, she found a simple wooden box, worn with age, its surface marked by years of careful handling. Inside the box rested several neatly bundled letters tied together with faded blue ribbon, a leather-bound notebook unlike any she had seen in her father's study, dozens of old photographs, and a sealed envelope bearing only 2 handwritten words. For Emily. She resisted the urge to open the envelope first. Experience had already taught her that Richard wanted this story understood in a particular order. She reached instead for the notebook. Unlike her father's journals, this one belonged to someone else. The handwriting was softer, more rounded, unmistakably feminine. There was no signature on the opening page, only a date from nearly 31 years earlier and a single sentence written with quiet conviction. Some promises are made because we hope life will become easier. Others are made because breaking them would destroy someone we love. Emily felt her heartbeat quicken. She turned another page and immediately recognized the name written within the first paragraph. Richard. Whoever had written this notebook knew her father long before the world knew his name. As Emily continued reading, it became clear that the notebook belonged to Margaret Hayes. These were not daily diary entries, but deeply personal reflections written during moments of enormous uncertainty. Margaret described the early years of a struggling business where every unpaid invoice threatened to end months of exhausting work. She wrote about employees who believed in Richard even when customers did not. She described borrowed equipment, second-hand machinery, and nights when the future of the company depended on finding enough money to cover one more week of wages. Yet nowhere did she portray herself as a servant or employee. Instead, she wrote as someone standing shoulder to shoulder with Richard while they fought to keep a shared dream alive. Her words carried admiration for his determination, but also concern over the enormous pressure he placed upon himself. Emily paused several times, trying to reconcile this version of Margaret with the quiet housekeeper she had known throughout her life. They felt like two entirely different people connected only by the same name. One photograph resting beneath the notebook drew Emily's attention. It showed Richard and Margaret standing outside the original warehouse that had become Whitmore Industrial's first headquarters. Their clothes were simple, their expressions exhausted, but both were smiling with unmistakable pride. Richard held a small wooden sign displaying the company's original logo, while Margaret stood beside him covered in dust. One sleeve rolled to her elbow as though she had spent the day working alongside everyone else. Written across the back in Margaret's handwriting were the words, "We finally opened the doors." Emily stared at the image in disbelief. The official company history credited Richard alone with launching Whitmore Industrial. Yet this photograph suggested Margaret had been present on the very first day, not as hired help, but as someone whose efforts were woven into the company's foundation. If the public story had omitted that truth, how many others had disappeared with it? The letters bundled beneath the photographs answered some questions, while creating many more. Most had been written by Richard over a period of several years. He thanked Margaret repeatedly for sacrifices she refused to discuss with anyone else. He apologized for opportunities she surrendered because of decisions they believed were necessary at the time. In one letter, he admitted that every achievement celebrated by the public reminded him of everything Margaret had quietly given up. Yet frustratingly, the letters never explained exactly what those sacrifices involved. Richard wrote as though both of them understood the events perfectly, leaving Emily to piece together fragments without the benefit of context. The pattern became unmistakable: gratitude, regret, loyalty, debt. Those 4 themes echoed through nearly every page, suggesting that whatever happened between them had shaped the course of both their lives in ways no outsider ever recognized. Finally, Emily reached for the sealed envelope carrying her name. Unlike the earlier letter delivered after the funeral, this one appeared much older. The paper had yellowed with time, and the seal showed signs of being handled repeatedly without ever being opened. Richard had clearly written it years before his death, then chosen to preserve it until the right moment arrived. Emily carefully unfolded the pages inside. The first lines immediately stopped her. Richard explained that there were many versions of his life, the one celebrated by newspapers, the one remembered by employees, the one experienced by Emily, and the one carried silently by Margaret. He admitted that none of those versions were complete on their own. Only together could they reveal the truth. Then came the sentence that changed everything Emily believed she understood. Your mother begged me to tell you this while she was still alive, but I asked for more time. I spent the next 28 years convincing myself there would always be another opportunity. I was wrong. Now you must learn why Margaret Hayes became part of our family long before you were ever born, and why everything I owned belonged to her long before the world believed it belonged to me. Emily read the final sentence again, this time much more slowly, allowing every word to settle into place. Her father had not written that he chose to give everything to Margaret. He wrote that it already belonged to her long before anyone believed it belonged to him. The distinction was impossible to ignore. Richard Whitmore, a man celebrated for creating one of the largest privately owned manufacturing companies in America, was quietly admitting that the foundation of his fortune rested on something the public had never been allowed to see. For years, people praised his determination, intelligence, and willingness to take extraordinary risks. Now, after his death, he was asking his daughter to question whether the story that made him famous had ever been complete. Emily carefully folded the letter and placed it beside the notebook. The inheritance no longer appeared to be the surprising decision of an aging billionaire. It was beginning to look like the final chapter of an obligation Richard had carried for most of his adult life, one he believed could never be fully explained through legal documents alone. She turned back to Margaret's notebook. Hopping the next pages would finally explain how two ordinary people had become connected so deeply that one would eventually inherit an empire. Instead, the entries shifted toward a period marked by increasing uncertainty. Margaret described months of financial pressure unlike anything the young company had faced before. Orders had slowed, suppliers demanded payment, and several employees feared layoffs were unavoidable. Richard refused to dismiss anyone who depended on the business for their livelihood, even though doing so might have saved the company from collapse. Margaret wrote that she admired his loyalty, but worried it would ultimately destroy everything they had built together. She mentioned evenings spent reviewing unpaid invoices, searching for ways to keep the business alive without sacrificing the people who had believed in them from the beginning. Every page reflected determination, exhaustion, and quiet hope. Yet one particular entry ended with a sentence that immediately caught Emily's attention. Tomorrow, I will make the decision Richard must never know was mine. Emily searched the following pages expecting an explanation, but several had been carefully removed. Whoever had taken them had done so years earlier with remarkable precision, leaving only clean edges where entire sections once existed. She flipped forward, then backward, convinced there had to be some mistake. The missing pages covered nearly 3 months, exactly the period during which Whitmore Industrial transformed from a struggling operation into a stable company capable of attracting serious investors. Richard's journals hinted repeatedly at an enormous sacrifice. Margaret's notebook referred to a life-changing decision she intended to keep hidden. The missing pages almost certainly connected those two stories, yet they had vanished completely. Emily felt a growing frustration she had not experienced since the funeral. Every discovery answered one question only to replace it with another. Someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to preserve this secret, even within documents never intended for public view. As she continued examining the contents of the wooden box, another envelope slipped from beneath the photographs. This one carried the logo of a small law office that no longer existed. Inside rested copies of property records dating back more than 30 years. At first they seemed ordinary enough, documenting ownership transfers involving the original warehouse where Whitmore Industrial had begun. Then Emily noticed the signatures. Before Richard Whitmore became the legal owner of the property, it had belonged to Margaret Hayes. Emily frowned, certain she had misunderstood what she was reading. According to every official biography, Richard purchased the abandoned warehouse using borrowed money after convincing a local bank to take a chance on his business plan. Yet these records told an entirely different story. Margaret had owned the property first. Months later, she transferred ownership to Richard for $1. There were no conditions attached, no repayment schedule, no explanation. Simply a legal transfer placing the company's future into Richard's hands. Emily leaned back in her chair, overwhelmed by the significance of what she had found. That warehouse had become the birthplace of a billion-dollar enterprise. Every expansion, every manufacturing plant, every acquisition, every fortune generated over the following 4 decades could be traced back to that first building. Without it, Whitmore Industrial would never have existed. Richard had always described purchasing the warehouse as the turning point that changed his life. Yet he had never mentioned that Margaret owned it before he did. The realization forced Emily to reconsider every interview, every speech, and every documentary celebrating her father's career. He had not lied outright. He simply omitted the person standing at the beginning of the story. The public saw Richard as the sole architect of his success. Richard himself seemed to have spent the rest of his life trying to repay the person who made that success possible. Still, the question remained painfully incomplete. Why would Margaret willingly give away something so valuable for almost nothing? People do not surrender property capable of creating enormous wealth unless driven by extraordinary circumstances. Richard's letters described gratitude beyond words. Margaret's notebook spoke of a decision she intended to keep secret forever. Catherine understood the truth, yet never revealed it. All the pieces pointed toward one defining event, but the event itself remained hidden behind missing pages and unfinished explanations. Emily glanced once more through the photographs, until one image she had overlooked earlier suddenly drew her attention. It showed Richard and Margaret standing outside a small neighborhood church beside an elderly couple Emily did not recognize. On the back someone had written, "The Harrisons. Thank you for believing when nobody else would." The name stirred something faint in Emily's memory. During her childhood, she occasionally heard Richard mention a retired pastor named Samuel Harrison whenever conversations turned toward the earliest days of the company. Richard always spoke of him with unusual respect, describing him as someone whose advice arrived exactly when it was needed most. Emily had never met the man, assuming he had passed away years earlier. Curious, she searched the internet using her phone while sitting inside the bank's private room. To her surprise, she discovered that Reverend Samuel Harrison was still alive, now 92 years old, living quietly in a small assisted living community several hours away. An old newspaper profile described him as a longtime pastor known for helping struggling families and small business owners during difficult economic times. Buried near the end of the article was a single sentence mentioning that one of the proudest moments of his ministry involved supporting a young entrepreneur who later became billionaire industrialist Richard Whitmore. Emily immediately understood why the name had been preserved inside the box. If anyone remained alive who remembered the years before Whitmore Industrial became famous, it might be Samuel Harrison. Unlike business executives or attorneys, the retired pastor had known Richard and Margaret before wealth complicated their lives. He may have witnessed the decisions hidden behind missing journal pages and carefully guarded family stories. Emily carefully returned every document to the wooden box, thanking the bank manager before leaving with permission to keep its contents temporarily while the estate remained under legal review. As she stepped outside into the cool afternoon air, she realized her investigation had finally produced something more valuable than another clue. For the first time since the funeral, there was a living person who might answer the question haunting every discovery she had made. She started the engine and began the long drive toward the assisted living community, unaware that the elderly pastor had spent nearly 3 decades honoring a promise to Richard and Margaret, believing the truth would remain buried until the day Emily finally came looking for it. The highway stretched for miles beneath an overcast sky as Emily drove toward the quiet Pennsylvania town where Reverend Samuel Harrison now lived. She welcomed the silence because it gave her time to organize everything she had discovered during the previous 2 days. Individually, each piece of evidence seemed incomplete. Together, they formed the outline of a story that had never been told in full. Margaret Hayes had known Richard years before the world believed they met. She had stood beside him during the earliest days of Whitmore Industrial. She had owned the warehouse that became the company's foundation. Richard spent decades writing about a debt he believed could never truly be repaid. Catherine understood the truth and chose to protect it. Entire sections of Margaret's journal had disappeared. The official company history had quietly erased Margaret's role while preserving every other detail with remarkable precision. None of those discoveries pointed toward greed. If anything, they suggested the opposite. Margaret seemed to have spent her entire life avoiding recognition, while Richard devoted the rest of his life trying to honor a promise that remained hidden from everyone, including the daughter he loved. The assisted living community occupied a peaceful hillside surrounded by towering maple trees that had witnessed generations come and go. It was the kind of place where time seemed to move more gently than the rest of the world. Emily introduced herself at the front desk, uncertain whether Reverend Harrison would even remember her father after so many years. The receptionist smiled warmly before explaining that the pastor still enjoyed visitors, especially those connected to families he had known throughout his ministry. A few moments later, Emily found herself walking down a quiet hallway lined with framed photographs of community gatherings, baptisms, weddings, and charity events spanning decades. Every picture reflected lives shaped not by headlines or financial success, but by ordinary acts of kindness. She could not help wondering whether her father's greatest chapter had also unfolded far away from newspaper cameras and corporate boardrooms. Reverend Samuel Harrison looked remarkably strong for a man in his 90s. His silver hair had thinned, his movements had slowed, but his eyes remained sharp with the calm confidence of someone who had spent a lifetime listening more than speaking. As Emily introduced herself, a gentle smile crossed his face. There was no confusion, no hesitation, only quiet recognition. He softly remarked that Richard always believed this day would eventually come, though he had prayed it would arrive much sooner. Emily felt her pulse quicken. The pastor's first words confirmed that her father had expected her search long before his death. Whatever truth Richard had hidden, he had trusted Samuel Harrison to guard it until Emily was ready to hear it. The pastor looked toward the window for several moments before gathering his thoughts. He explained that memory becomes a curious thing with age. Many ordinary days disappear, while moments carrying enormous consequence remain perfectly clear regardless of how many years pass. Richard Whitmore and Margaret Hayes belonged to that second category. He remembered them as 2 determined young people carrying burdens far heavier than anyone their age should have faced. They worked harder than almost everyone around them, yet neither cared much about recognition. Richard dreamed of building something that would provide stability for hundreds of families. Margaret dreamed of helping him succeed, even if no one ever knew how much she contributed. According to the pastor, they shared an uncommon trust built not on business but on loyalty. That loyalty would eventually be tested in ways neither of them could have imagined. Emily listened carefully, noticing that the pastor chose every word with extraordinary care, almost as though he still respected promises made decades earlier. He explained that many people later assumed Margaret became Richard's employee because it was the simplest story available. The truth was far more complicated. Before Whitmore Industrial existed, Margaret worked as a licensed accountant for a small manufacturing supplier struggling through difficult financial times. Richard frequently visited the company searching for affordable materials while trying to launch his own business. Their friendship developed through countless conversations about survival, responsibility, and the risks involved in chasing impossible dreams. Margaret quickly recognized something unusual in Richard. Unlike many ambitious entrepreneurs, he measured success less by personal wealth than by the opportunity to create stable jobs for people who desperately needed them. That purpose convinced her his dream deserved a chance. The pastor paused before continuing, as though deciding how much he should reveal at once. He explained that Richard's greatest obstacle had never been talent or determination. It had been access to opportunity. Banks repeatedly rejected his business proposals because he possessed almost no collateral. Investors admired his ideas but considered him too inexperienced to justify the enormous risk. Each rejection pushed his dream closer to disappearing altogether. Margaret refused to accept that outcome. She spent weeks searching for alternatives, contacting lenders, reviewing property auctions, and exploring every possibility she could find. Eventually, she discovered the abandoned warehouse that later became the birthplace of Whitmore Industrial. The building was inexpensive because it required extensive repairs, yet even that reduced price remained beyond Richard's reach. The opportunity existed, but without immediate funding, someone else would purchase it first. According to Reverend Harrison, the decision Margaret made during those days changed the course of every life connected to the Whitmore family. She quietly sold nearly everything she owned. Savings accumulated over years of careful work disappeared into a single transaction. She borrowed against property inherited from her late parents, risking the only meaningful security she possessed. Then, without telling Richard the full extent of what she had sacrificed, she purchased the warehouse herself. Days later, she transferred ownership to him for $1, insisting that he focus entirely on building the company instead of worrying about repaying her. Richard protested, believing such generosity bordered on recklessness, but Margaret remained firm. She insisted the business had a greater chance of improving countless lives than anything she could accomplish alone. She asked only one thing in return. If the company ever succeeded beyond their expectations, Richard must promise to remember how it truly began. Emily felt tears forming as she absorbed the weight of those words. The warehouse was never simply real estate. It represented Margaret's entire future placed into Richard's hands without any guarantee he would succeed. Every achievement that followed could be traced back to a choice requiring extraordinary faith. Yet one question still lingered. If Richard intended to honor Margaret's sacrifice, why spend decades allowing the world to believe he built everything alone? The pastor nodded gently before Emily even voiced the thought aloud. He admitted that this was the question he had wrestled with for years as well. Richard desperately wanted Margaret to receive public recognition, but Margaret refused every attempt. She believed attaching her name to the company's origin would distract from its mission and create unnecessary attention she never desired. She insisted the work mattered more than the credit. Richard reluctantly respected her wishes, though the decision haunted him for the rest of his life because gratitude expressed in private never seemed sufficient compared to what she had given away. The pastor slowly reached toward a small cabinet beside his chair and removed a weathered envelope that appeared almost as old as the photographs Emily had discovered inside the safe deposit box. He explained that Richard and Margaret visited him together shortly after the warehouse changed hands. During that meeting, they asked him to safeguard one document until both of them agreed the time had come to reveal it. Years passed. The company grew beyond anything they imagined. Then Catherine entered Richard's life, learned the truth, and joined them in protecting it. Eventually, Richard asked the pastor to continue holding the document unless Emily herself came searching after his death. Reverend Harrison carefully placed the envelope into Emily's hands. Across the front, written in Richard's unmistakable handwriting decades earlier, were the words that instantly told Emily she was closer than ever to understanding her father's final decision. The promise we made before there was anything to leave behind. Emily held the envelope with both hands, afraid that opening it too quickly might somehow diminish the significance of the moment. Nearly every important discovery since the funeral had pointed toward one defining promise, yet none had explained what that promise actually required. The faded paper before her had survived more than 3 decades, passing from Richard Whitmore to Reverend Samuel Harrison, without ever reaching the person it was ultimately intended for. Emily carefully broke the brittle seal and unfolded several handwritten pages. The document was not a legal contract. It carried no official letterhead, no notarized signatures, and no language designed for a courtroom. Instead, it was a simple statement written jointly by 2 young people who had almost nothing except faith in one another. Richard's handwriting filled the first page, while Margaret's appeared beneath it. Together they recorded the circumstances surrounding the purchase of the warehouse and the extraordinary risk Margaret had accepted. Then, near the bottom of the page, Richard made a promise that would shape the rest of his life. If success ever came, he would spend however many years remained to him ensuring Margaret never carried the burden of that sacrifice alone again. Emily turned to the second page expecting the promise to end there, but Richard had continued writing. He admitted that no amount of future wealth could truly balance what Margaret had placed at risk, because the value of her decision could never be measured only in money. She had trusted him before the world had any reason to believe in him. She had protected his dream when every practical argument suggested walking away would be the wiser choice. Richard wrote that people often celebrated those standing at the finish line, while forgetting the person willing to stand beside them at the starting line, when failure appeared almost certain. He promised that if Whitmore Industrial ever became successful enough to change lives, Margaret would always be its silent foundation, regardless of whether history acknowledged her or not. Emily paused after reading those words, overwhelmed by the sincerity they carried. They were not written by a billionaire looking backward with regret. They came from a struggling young businessman who genuinely believed he might never have the opportunity to repay what had been given to him. Yet one detail continued troubling Emily. If Margaret willingly chose anonymity, why had Richard waited until his death to fulfill the promise in such a dramatic way? He could have quietly transferred assets during his lifetime. He could have established trusts, partnerships, or charitable foundations recognizing her contributions without shocking his daughter and the entire business community. The pastor seemed to anticipate her thoughts. He explained that Richard had attempted exactly that on several occasions. Whenever Whitmore Industrial reached a new level of success, Richard tried offering Margaret ownership, executive positions, financial gifts, and even retirement estates purchased solely for her comfort. Every single offer was politely refused. Margaret insisted that accepting extraordinary wealth for herself would betray the very reason she had supported Richard in the first place. She never believed in building a company to become rich. She believed in building something capable of giving ordinary families the stability both of them had lacked while growing up. Richard admired her conviction, but every refusal deepened the debt he believed remained unpaid. The pastor leaned back in his chair and quietly reflected on how differently Richard and Margaret carried the same memory. Richard remembered the warehouse as a gift he could never fully repay. Margaret remembered it simply as the right decision made at the right moment. While Richard accumulated gratitude over the years, Margaret accumulated peace because she never expected anything in return. Their perspectives slowly drifted apart. Richard measured the promise through obligation. Margaret measured it through purpose. Catherine understood both sides better than anyone. She often reminded Richard that gratitude expressed through faithful living mattered just as much as financial repayment. Richard agreed with her in principle, but privately he confessed to Reverend Harrison that he still woke many mornings believing he had benefited far more than Margaret ever had. Every new manufacturing plant, every profitable quarter, Every award placed another weight upon his conscience, because he knew none of it would have existed without the decision she made before anyone believed his company had a future. Emily remained silent, absorbing the enormous difference between public success and private memory. She had spent years admiring her father's discipline, without realizing he quietly viewed his greatest achievement as something he never earned alone. The revelation changed the way she remembered countless conversations from childhood. Richard often spoke about responsibility rather than ownership. He reminded Emily that wealth carried obligations extending beyond legal rights. At the time, those lessons sounded like ordinary business philosophy. Now they felt deeply personal. Perhaps he had been trying to prepare her for this truth long before illness forced him to confront it directly. If so, she had misunderstood every lesson because she lacked the one piece of history giving those lessons their true meaning. Reverend Harrison slowly rose from his chair and walked toward a bookshelf where an old framed photograph rested among family pictures. He handed it to Emily without speaking. The image showed Richard, Margaret, Catherine, and the pastor standing together outside the original warehouse shortly after Whitmore Industrial secured its first major contract. Emily noticed the expressions immediately. Richard looked relieved. Catherine appeared joyful. Margaret smiled gently, though with the same quiet humility Emily remembered from throughout her childhood. Written across the bottom of the photograph in Catherine's handwriting were the words, "Some families are created by blood. Others are created by promises." Emily's eyes filled with tears. Her mother had understood Margaret's place within the family all along. She had never viewed her as competition or an outsider. Instead, Catherine recognized that, without Margaret's sacrifice, the life she later shared with Richard might never have existed at all. The pastor carefully returned the photograph to its place before speaking again. He explained that, although the warehouse marked the beginning of Richard's success, it was not the greatest sacrifice Margaret ever made. His voice softened noticeably, and for the first time since Emily arrived, genuine sadness crossed his face. He admitted there was another chapter neither Richard nor Margaret ever found the strength to discuss openly, even with Catherine. It happened several years after the company began growing steadily, at a time when Richard believed the worst struggles were finally behind them. That single event altered all three of their lives forever. It was also the reason Margaret eventually entered the Whitmore household under the title of housekeeper, instead of remaining publicly connected to the company she helped create. Reverend Harrison looked directly into Emily's eyes before continuing. He quietly confessed that if the warehouse represented the debt Richard could repay with money, what happened afterward created a debt no fortune could ever erase. Richard spent the rest of his life believing that everything he accomplished after that day belonged morally to Margaret because she surrendered something infinitely more valuable than property. Emily felt her breath catch as the full weight of the pastor's words settled over the room. Every clue she had uncovered since the funeral had been leading not toward the beginning of the story, but toward a tragedy still hidden somewhere in the years that followed. A tragedy so profound that her father carried it in silence until the day he died. Emily sat perfectly still, unable to speak. The room that had felt peaceful only minutes earlier now seemed heavy with the weight of unanswered questions. Until this moment, every discovery had centered on sacrifice measured in property, opportunity, and financial risk. Those were burdens she could understand. They explained Richard's gratitude, his lifelong sense of obligation, and even the extraordinary inheritance that had stunned everyone at the funeral. But Reverend Harrison had just introduced something entirely different. He was speaking about a loss that could not be restored with money, a wound that remained untouched despite 4 decades of success. Emily thought back to the expression on Margaret's face when the will was read. It had never resembled relief. It had looked like someone reopening a chapter of grief she had spent years trying to keep closed. For the first time since Richard's death, Emily realized the inheritance itself may have been the one outcome Margaret never wanted. It forced into public view a history she had spent most of her life protecting. The pastor lowered himself back into his chair before continuing. He explained that memories become difficult to carry when they belong to more than one person. Every survivor remembers the same event differently, yet each version contains part of the truth. Richard carried overwhelming guilt. Margaret carried acceptance. Catherine carried compassion for them both. None of those perspectives contradicted one another, but together they formed a story almost impossible to explain without reopening old wounds. That was why everyone involved agreed years earlier to remain silent unless circumstances left no other choice. Richard believed he would eventually tell Emily everything himself. Catherine encouraged him repeatedly, convinced their daughter deserved the truth while they were still together. Richard always agreed, but each time the moment arrived, he postponed it again. He convinced himself there would always be another birthday, another family dinner, another quiet evening when the conversation could finally happen. Illness arrived before that opportunity ever did. The pastor slowly folded his hands together and looked toward the window, as though replaying events that had unfolded decades earlier. Whitmore Industrial had finally begun generating steady profits. The uncertainty of the early years was fading, and Richard had started discussing plans for expansion beyond Ohio. Employees who had accepted lower wages during the company's difficult beginnings were receiving raises. Families that once feared unemployment finally experienced stability. Richard believed the hardest chapter of his life had ended. Then one autumn evening, a devastating fire broke out inside the original warehouse. It spread with terrifying speed through old electrical wiring before emergency crews could contain it. Several workers escaped with minor injuries, but one employee remained trapped inside after returning to retrieve accounting records that insurance investigators later considered replaceable. Richard ran toward the building without hesitation, ignoring every warning shouted around him. He believed someone was still alive inside. Emily felt her heart begin to race. She already sensed where the story was heading, yet she desperately hoped her instincts were wrong. Reverend Harrison explained that Richard entered the smoke-filled building with almost no regard for his own safety. Visibility had disappeared. Sections of the roof had already begun collapsing. Firefighters arriving at the scene later admitted that anyone entering at that stage accepted extraordinary risk. Richard eventually located the injured employee but found himself disoriented while trying to reach an exit. Flames had blocked the route he remembered. Heavy beams crashed onto the warehouse floor. The heat became almost unbearable. Witnesses standing outside believed both men would die before rescuers could reach them. Then, without warning, another figure entered the building. It was Margaret. The pastor's voice remained calm, but Emily could hear the sadness beneath every word. Margaret had been reviewing financial records in a nearby office when the fire started. She watched Richard disappear inside and immediately understood what he intended to do. Without waiting for permission or assistance, she followed him into the smoke. Those outside tried to stop her, but she refused to stand by while Richard remained trapped. Minutes later, she found both men barely conscious beneath fallen debris. Working through intense heat and rapidly thickening smoke, she helped free the injured employee first. Richard insisted the other man leave ahead of them, believing there was still enough time. There was. Another section of the roof collapsed before Richard and Margaret could reach the exit together. The pastor paused for several moments before continuing. His eyes no longer focused on Emily, but somewhere far beyond the room itself. Firefighters eventually reached the pair just as conditions inside the warehouse became impossible to survive much longer. Richard escaped with burns and smoke inhalation that required months of recovery. Margaret's injuries were far more severe. She suffered extensive burns to her arms and shoulders while shielding Richard from collapsing debris during the final moments before rescue teams reached them. Recovery demanded multiple surgeries followed by months of painful rehabilitation. Doctors believed she would never regain full strength in one arm. Throughout that entire ordeal, Margaret repeatedly refused public attention. Newspaper articles praised Richard's courage for attempting the rescue, because reporters never learned she had entered the warehouse after him. Fire officials knew the truth, but Margaret privately asked them not to correct the record. She insisted the focus remain on rebuilding the company and supporting employees whose livelihoods depended upon it. Emily closed her eyes as tears quietly rolled down her face. Every newspaper clipping she had ever seen described her father as the man who nearly gave his life saving one of his workers. The story became part of Whitmore Industrial's identity, reinforcing Richard's reputation as a leader willing to risk everything for his employees. Yet hidden behind that celebrated account was another truth. Richard survived because Margaret refused to leave him behind. Once again, she had protected both the man and the company while accepting that history might never remember her contribution. Emily suddenly understood why Richard wrote so often about debts impossible to repay. The warehouse had given him his future. The fire had preserved his life. Reverend Harrison quietly nodded, recognizing the realization spreading across Emily's face. He explained that Richard never forgave himself for allowing Margaret to carry the consequences of that day. During her long recovery, she insisted the company continue moving forward rather than delaying expansion because of her injuries. She even returned to work before doctors recommended, determined to help stabilize the business after the devastating loss caused by the fire. Richard begged her to accept a formal executive position with significant ownership in the company. Margaret declined. She argued that public recognition would only invite questions she had no interest in answering. She believed the company needed confidence from investors more than another complicated story from its past. Richard reluctantly accepted her decision, but the guilt only deepened. Every success achieved after the fire reminded him that someone else had paid a physical price, so he could continue building the future he dreamed about. The pastor's expression grew even more solemn. He admitted that as painful as the fire had been, it was still not the event Richard carried most heavily inside his heart. In many ways, the fire only set in motion the tragedy that followed. During Margaret's recovery, another crisis emerged, one so deeply personal that only 4 people ever knew the complete truth: Richard, Margaret, Catherine, and Reverend Harrison himself. It was that moment, not the warehouse, not the fire, that ultimately transformed Margaret from the quiet co-founder of a growing company into the woman who would spend the next 28 years living inside the Whitmore home under a title that concealed who she had really been. Richard believed revealing that truth during his lifetime would have destroyed promises made in love rather than ambition. But now, with Richard gone and Catherine gone, only one person remained who could finally understand why the last page of his life looked so shocking to everyone else. Emily realized she was only beginning to uncover the deepest secret her family had guarded for almost 3 decades. The room fell silent once again. Emily noticed that Reverend Harrison no longer seemed like a man recalling history. He looked like someone reliving it. His hands rested quietly on the arms of his chair, but the sadness in his eyes suggested that no amount of passing time had lessened the weight of the memories he carried. Emily wanted to ask the question that had been growing louder with every new revelation, but she held back. She had learned that rushing this story only caused important pieces to disappear. Richard had spent decades protecting the truth, and the pastor had guarded it with equal care. Whatever came next deserved to be understood completely, rather than reduced to a single shocking sentence. She took a slow breath and waited. The pastor eventually nodded, almost as though he appreciated her patience. Then he continued with a chapter of the story that Richard had never found the strength to tell himself. Several months after the warehouse fire, Whitmore Industrial slowly returned to normal operations. The damaged building had been repaired, employees returned to work, and new contracts restored confidence among investors. To the outside world, the company had survived one of the greatest challenges in its young history. Newspapers praised Richard's resilience, customers admired the speed of the recovery, and business journals pointed to Whitmore Industrial as an example of leadership under pressure. Inside the company, however, very little felt normal. Richard could not look at Margaret without remembering that she carried permanent scars because she had chosen to save him. Margaret, meanwhile, behaved as though nothing extraordinary had happened. She resumed reviewing financial reports, helping negotiate supplier agreements, and encouraging younger employees who worried about the future. She never mentioned the injuries unless someone directly asked, and even then she dismissed them as insignificant compared to the lives that had been preserved that day. Her ability to move forward only made Richard's guilt more difficult to bear. Catherine entered this chapter of their lives with remarkable grace. By then she and Richard had been married for several years, and Emily was still too young to understand the quiet struggles unfolding around her. Catherine quickly realized that Margaret's place within their lives extended far beyond friendship or business. She also recognized that Richard's gratitude had become intertwined with a sense of responsibility that he struggled to express. Rather than feeling threatened by Margaret's presence, Catherine welcomed her with genuine warmth. She often reminded Richard that true loyalty should never become a source of shame. If Margaret had sacrificed so much for the family they now shared, then she deserved to remain part of that family in whatever way brought her peace. Those words comforted Richard for a time, yet they could not erase the feeling that he still owed Margaret something far greater than appreciation. The pastor explained that life has a way of testing people just when they believe they have finally found stability. Nearly 5 years after the warehouse fire, another unexpected crisis arrived. This time it had nothing to do with business. Margaret received devastating medical news after a routine examination revealed a serious illness affecting someone she loved more than anyone else in the world. Emily listened carefully as Reverend Harrison described a chapter of Margaret's life that had never once been mentioned inside the Whitmore household. Before meeting Richard, Margaret had been raising her younger sister, Abigail, after the death of their parents. The two sisters had survived enormous hardship together, relying on one another through years of financial uncertainty. Abigail had encouraged Margaret to pursue opportunities instead of giving up on her own future, just as Margaret later encouraged Richard. By the time Whitmore Industrial began succeeding, Abigail had built a quiet life of her own, remaining close to Margaret despite preferring privacy over public attention.